trouble. And boy, I found her. She's in love with herself. She likes the dark. Grey Wolf Studios.
What's up, guys? It's me, Grey Wolf. I'm back here to do another video for you guys. This video is video number 4 in my multi-part video series on electric RCs for beginners. And we're going to pick up where we left off. We left off in the last video talking about electric motors. We covered can size in the last video. This video we're going to cover a couple different topics. The first one is kV rating. So if we take a look at this Castle motor here, you'll see a bunch of stuff written underneath the brand name there: 410-1Y, 3800 kV, 12 NIMH/3S LiPo Max. Now the 1410 there is simply referring to the model number. That's the model number of this Castle motor. So this is a Castle 1410. The 1Y, the wind type. There's two different types of winds. There's Y winds and then there's delta winds, and I'll cover that in the next video. But so just be aware of there's two different ways to wind the copper wire in a motor. And then I'm going to skip 3800 kV because I'm going to come back and talk about that. That's actually going to be our topic. But then the motor also tells us that you can run this motor on up to 12 nickel metal hydride cells or 3 LiPo cells. That's the maximum voltage that this motor can take. Now the 3800 kV, that's what we're going to talk about, the kV ratings. Your brushless, sensorless motors, and sometimes your sensored motors will have kV ratings. Now, kV rating is simply just a way to compare one motor to another motor. Now, this is a Tekin SC4X 550 can motor, which can run sensored or sensorless, either one, which is why it has a turn rating listed on it. And I'll get to turn ratings here in a bit. But this is also, if you look this motor up on their website, it'll also give you a kV value for this motor, which is 4,000 kV. So basically what we can extrapolate from that, the kV ratings are, like I said, are just a way to compare one motor to another motor in terms of speed and torque. Now can size can play a part in torque as well. So if you compare these two 1/10 scale motors right here, we can basically determine that this one is slightly faster because it's a 4,000 kV instead of a 3,800 kV. Maybe I should just back up for a second here and actually explain what kV is. kV, the kV number is basically the number of RPMs that the motor will turn for every volt that's put into it. So this is a 3800 kV motor. If you put 1 volt into it, it'll spin at 3800 RPMs. If you put 10 volts into it, it'll spin at 38,000 RPMs, at least theoretically. Now, gearing and weight of your kit and all those kind of factors will actually change what your realistic RPMs are. But that's basically the theoretical no load RPMs that it would do per volt. So if we compare this 3800 to this 4000 here, well, we know that the 4000 is a little bit faster. It's got a slightly higher RPM rating, but if these were both 540 can motors, we would say that this one's faster, but this one has a little bit more torque. However, there's a couple other things to take into consideration. You also have to take into consideration that this is a 550 can motor. This is only a 540. So this being a 540, or I'm sorry, a 550 can motor, we already know that this naturally has more torque than a 540 can motor does. So if that were the only two factors, then this would actually be a far superior motor to this, because not only is this slightly faster, but it would also have a little bit more torque, since it's a 550 can instead of a 540. However, now here's where a curveball gets thrown in. This is no standard 3800 kV motor. This is actually a 4-pole motor. Now, four-pole motors have more torque than 2-pole motors. And if these were both 540 size motors, the 4-pole would have way more torque than the 2-pole. However, since this is a 550 can, this has more torque than your standard 540 can. Which one has more torque? That's kind of hard to say. Probably this one, actually, because not only is it 4 poles, but it's slightly lower kV, which means it's naturally going to be a little bit torqueier than this one anyway. It's hard for me to say for certain, because I haven't really run this motor yet, so I'm not entirely familiar with how much torque exactly this one puts out. This one I'm very familiar with, and I'm very familiar with the Tekin 8 scale motors. They're 10 scale motors, however, I haven't really used the 10 scale motors yet. This one is going in a short course truck, my Durango short course truck, once I get it built, but at the moment it's in pieces. So at any rate, so both of these are going to be pretty torquey motors. In terms of 10th scale, these are both kind of middle of the road kV motors. So really, either one of these motors would be an excellent choice to use. Probably the Tekin is probably a little bit better, since you can run it censored, and I don't know if their 10 scale motors do dual drive or not. I believe that all of their censored motors that you run off of the RX8 speed controller, I think are capable of doing the dual drive stuff. So given the fact that this is capable of dual drive, and it's a 550 can, I would almost dare to say that the Tekin would be a better motor. Of course, they're more expensive than the Castle sensorless motor. The price difference isn't as much as you think it probably would be. I would think the Tekin motors would be more expensive than the Castles. And they are a little bit, but not nearly as much as they should be. The Castle just charges too much money for their stuff, in my opinion. But at any rate, that's neither here nor there. So at any rate, if you take into account that this is a 550, this is a 4-pole motor, so they're both going to be really torquey. They're both very similar in kV rating. So both of these motors would be good motors to use. Now Tekin actually makes a Pro 4, which is a 10th scale 4-pole motor that's also capable of censored or sensorless and dual drive if you use it with an RX8. So if you had one of those, that motor would probably be better than either one of these. Now the Pro 4 is a 540 can motor, but it's 4-pole. So anyway, this motor here is a 2650. Now we know this is an 8th scale motor, so we automatically know that this motor is going to be lower kV than these two, and it's going to be a lot torqueier. That's just the nature. That's just the nature of the beast. The bigger the motor is, typically the lower the kV ranges are, because the bigger motors are just naturally torqueier. But at any rate, so motors that are censored a lot of times will have turn ratings, like our Tekin SC4X here is a 5.5 turn censored motor. Well, it can actually do censored or censorless, either one. But if you use it censored, it's a 5.5 turn. Now, turns are essentially just like kV. It's just another way to compare motors. Turns actually came about before brushless motors even existed, I believe. I think the original brushed motors, one of the first ways to kind of measure them or compare them to other motors was the turn rating. And I believe the turn rating has to do with in some way, shape, or form. I'm not overly familiar with the internal workings of brushless motors, but I believe it has to do with the number of times that the wires wrapped around each stator inside the motor. I believe that's the case. I could be mistaken, but at any rate, just know that turn rating is just like kV. Only it works in reverse, and by that I mean the lower the turn number, the higher the RPM of the motor and the less torque it has. So a 4.5 turn motor would have a higher RPM rating but less torque than a 5.5. And a 45 turn motor, for example, like you'd find in a crawler, is going to have a crap load of torque but not very much on the top speed. So really, turns are really basically used for the same purpose that kV is used for, only turns are usually found on censored motors. Some of them, especially the ones that are capable of running either censored or censorless, like the Tekin motors, if you go to their website, a lot of times you can find a kV rating and a turn rating both for the same motor. So that's really all there is about the turns. Censored, censorless, and dual drive modes. Okay, so essentially, I kind of have to explain. I kind of have to explain how a brushless motor works inside. So if you look at this picture that I'm about to throw up on the screen right now, this basically shows a very basic diagram of how a brushless motor works. There's essentially 3 fields inside. Now there might actually be more than 3 stators inside the motor, but for all intents and purposes, there's only 3 fields at work at any given time, or 3 stators at work at any given time. The stators are the 3 poles you see coming off of the outside of the motor, pointing in toward the rotor, and the green lines there are supposed to represent the coiled copper wire around them. Now, so essentially what happens is you have your rotor in there, and your rotor basically, on a standard 2-pole brushless motor, your rotor will basically, one half of it will be it will be a north polarized magnet, and the other half will be a south polarized magnet. Now, as you know, the north field of a magnet will repel does it repel the light field or the opposite field? I forget. At any rate, you know how magnets, when you try to put them together, if you don't have the right sides facing together for it to stick, it'll repel, right? Well, so it's kind of the same principle here. The motor will basically put a positive charge in one field, a negative charge on the other field, which causes the rotor to move in such a fashion that that the magnets are going to be attracted to the proper fields, right? And the third field that is essentially not charged one way or the other, essentially when you're running in brush or when you're running in sensorless mode, that field or that line, if you will, going back to the ESC, is used to basically deliver information back to the ESC on basically gives an approximation of where the rotor's at, so the motor can activate the next two fields, and it basically just goes around switching those fields, and essentially it makes the rotor chase the fields created by the stators. So I said all that to say this. If you're running sensorless, I just described sensorless basically. That's how sensorless works. The inactive field, or I shouldn't say inactive because it's technically doing something, but the field that's not getting either a positive or negative charge is basically delivering information back to the ESC. Now that information is not nearly as accurate as if you're running sensored. If you're running sensored, you're going to have a cable plugged into the back of the motor that goes to the ESC. And that cable has 6 wires in it. And basically 2 wires go to each section of the motor, each of the 3 stators or fields, if you will. And those sensor wires, basically there's little sensors inside. I believe they're located on the stators, and the little sensors basically it uses the sensor wires to track more accurately what position the rotor's in. That's why when you're running sensored versus sensorless, you get that smoother acceleration, because the ESC knows the exact position of this rotor at any given second or nanosecond or whatever. I mean, it always knows where that rotor's at. So that's why sensored feels much more smooth than sensorless. Of course, sensorless typically, most people say that running sensorless has the advantage of having a little more top end than sensored does. But if you're honestly, most of the time, unless you're racing, there's probably not much need to run sensored. So if you're just bashing and you have the choice, it's up to you, but most people would probably pick sensorless just to get the extra power out of the motor. But there again, though, that's one of the reasons why I don't hardly buy anything but Tekin anymore, because I love the dual drive mode of the RX-8. It's like the best of both worlds. I get the smooth sensored acceleration, but the top end is still there. So at any rate, and that's exactly and that's the other part that I was going to cover, was dual drive mode. That's exactly what dual drive mode does. It basically gives you the best of both worlds. So that pretty much wraps it up for this video. That's the 3 topics that I wanted to cover in this video. And there is just one more thing I'll throw in right here at the end. I'm going to throw in another picture right here. And this picture is of a brushed motor. I showed you the diagram of the brushless motor. This is of the brushed motor. And a brush motor works essentially the exact opposite of a brushless motor. As you can see, your coils are no longer around the stators on the outside. Your coils are now wrapped around your armature, which is the part which is essentially like the rotor. The armature is essentially like the rotor, only instead of having magnets on it like the brushless one does, the rotor has or the armature rather has the coils around it, and then the magnets are actually inside of the can. You see your north pole magnet and your south pole magnet on either side of the can. If you look in there, there's the commutator, which is basically a piece of copper that contacts the brushes, which is what transfers the electricity from the brushes down into the coils. And those brushes are the part that wears out pretty quickly on brushed motors, and that has to be replaced quite often, and so on and so forth. But at any rate, I just thought I'd throw that out there since I kind of had to cover how a brushless motor works in order to explain sensored and sensorless and dual drive. I figured I might as well go ahead and show you guys the contrast to that, which is the brushless motor, or I mean the brushed motor, and basically how it works the exact opposite way. So anyway, that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next part, and we'll be right back.